Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 167. I'm delighted to be joined on the podcast today by Ben Ashworth, Director of Performance at Sparta Prague. Ben, how are you?
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
No problem, mate. Thank you for coming on. And like we do with everyone, Ben, I'm sure many people know about possibly your role now, which I'm sure they will, but definitely some previous roles. But can you give us a little insight into your career and what led you up to the role at Sparta Prague?
Yeah, sure. I'll try and keep it as short as possible, but I'm getting old now, so there's quite a lot of history. I started as a physio, and predominantly that's my background, is a physiotherapist with a degree finished back in 1997, and did a lot of sort of playing around with sport, and finally landed a job in rugby at London Wasps. And it was probably before I really knew what was going on around me in the performance world, but was really fortunate to work with some pretty high performing individuals on the pitch and off the pitch. And then went from rugby to Olympic sports. An opportunity came up to work with the Olympic Institute and the British Olympic Association, residential rehab, and working with athletes from summer and winter games, which was an incredible learning environment. And then from there went on to be in charge of a small team in London before the London 2012 games. And as a practitioner there, I ended up working with British Judo for 3 years just prior to the Olympics, which was getting my teeth stuck into working with a sport day to day and influencing a program over a 3-year period, which is another unique experience, and again one I was very fortunate to have. So that then led me towards being probably in a little bit of the shop window after the Olympics with a lot of good practitioners, but managed to get a lucky break from someone outside of football to land a job as first team physio at Arsenal. And I spent 6 happy years there, working with the team, with the first team, and a number of good practitioners. And then I left Arsenal when Arsene Wenger left, and had a year of, I like to call it midlife retirement. It was basically about 9 months. And then one of the players from Arsenal, who I'd worked closely with, became the sporting director out here in Sparta. And he called me up wanting to see if I knew anybody who would want the role. And one conversation led to another. And I ended up out here nearly 2.5 years ago now. And I came, it was pretty rapid. I think I went on a skiing holiday, and then before the end of the season, I ended up spending 8 weeks here, which wasn't the intention, but that's been a fantastic experience over the last 2.5 years, and it's still ongoing now.
Brilliant. And was the aim in your career to end up in football, or was that just how things worked out? Was it opportunity?
It's opportunity, definitely. Yeah, I think the job in football is an incredible experience, and slightly different from working in, say, jobs like Olympic sports. The scope and the scale of working in professional football, especially in the Premier League, is just massive. I'm sure some of my friends and colleagues who work in the NFL and big sports in the US as well have the same experience themselves. It's just everything is on a much larger scale. The stakes are higher. The finance and the investment is much higher. So yeah, I ended up in football, but it was largely because it was a really good job. And most of the career steps I've taken have been around wanting to work in the best jobs, not necessarily the easiest ones. But the ones that provide you with some scope to have an influence and work with good people solving problems on a day-to-day basis. So that Arsenal one was fantastic. And then since then, I've stayed in football. But I don't think that football is going to be where I am for the rest of my career necessarily. I think just a new look, a fresh look, a different sport, bit more sort of different stimulation when you go to a new place where you don't really understand a sport like a judo, or where you have to understand a culture like out here in the Czech Republic. There's got to be something always for me that provides that added stimulus, and perhaps that um, added ability to develop myself. And that's what I've tried to do continuously through each role that I've applied for or taken on. Yeah.
What were some of the key lessons? 'Cause obviously with Olympic sports, you're on that constant cycle of working towards the next games. Is there anything you took away from that to relate into obviously working in the Premier League and now with your current role?
Yeah, I mean, the incredible thing about the Olympic sports was the number of high quality practitioners. And so with the English Institute of Sport, the network's vast. You're working day to day with really good strength and conditioning coaches. You're working with physiologists, psychologists. It's just this, all-encompassing performance team. And so sometimes when you go into a new role, perhaps the thought process are different. You've got all the facilities, you've got all the technologies available to you, but are the processes and the ways of working actually supporting the team? And I think when you've got, a pencil and paper and you're one physio in charge of 28 players traveling around the world, managing injury audits and perhaps doing rehabs and everything, you're a sort of one-man band. And then you end up transitioning to a place where you've got 5 first-team physios working with 27 players. You can imagine the potential for the detail changes. But I think, what's interesting is it's always about people and process. It doesn't matter where you are, whatever level you're working at, whether it was Blackheath Rugby back in the day when I was doing some extra evening work, or whether it's Arsenal Football Club, it's the same thing, I think. Yeah,
brilliant. And I want to talk about the transition from head physio to director of performance in your current role, because we've had this debate, I suppose you call it, discussion around who should be, because we don't qualify as a director of performance. There isn't a degree to go and do that. Is there anything like that? But in terms of yourself, like getting into that role, and maybe others that are working in football or other sports right now, looking to get into a role like you're in at the moment, who do you think it should be? Like, is it a case of certain job roles should be considered, or is there more to it than just a sports scientist ending up as a director of performance or a physio or whatever?
Yeah, I'll just I'm not precious about these sorts of things, but I think I'll just pick you up on one thing. I was the first team physio, but I had a head physio. We'll come on to that later. Colin Lewin, who was hugely influential in my development and our team's development. So yeah, I worked under Colin there at Arsenal. So going from kind of first team physio to director of performance, I always said to the people that I worked with that I would be always every day thinking about what would I do? If I've got a boss or there's a leadership group and I'm looking up, how do I help them do their jobs? And often what that means is you're trying to take a sort of more overview or a bigger picture perspective of how your role interacts and how you can help the team as a whole. So I think if you've got anything about you, you're thinking about how you would work if you were in charge of the department. You're thinking about who you'd want to work with. Like, would you keep the team that you're working with? Would you want to recruit or change the dynamics depending on the personnel that you're working with? So I think if you've got anything about you, you're going to be looking to try and progress and have more and more influence. And from a position of first team physio, there are layers and always layers above you, and invariably you're going to have different opinions, which is a healthy thing to those people that you're working with. And I think then the chance to be in charge of the team, then where it ultimately comes down to reaching consensus, but you're the person with your sort of head on the chopping block to make that final call. That's the real reason why, it's a nice transition to be a director of performance or in charge of a team. And it's perhaps not a linear career path. Like some people would go physio to head physio, as you mentioned, and then they might go head physio to head of medical. And then, so but at a club like Arsenal, you're probably not going to get those opportunities to step up.
Yeah.
You're probably going to have to go elsewhere to go forwards. And I think the best thing, and I'm waffling a little bit here around this, but I think what was interesting was when I left Arsenal, I knew I didn't have to go back in as a first team physio. And in fact, I didn't have to take the first job that, came my way. I could wait, and that made me really look at it and think, well, what do I want? I wanted to be in a position of influence, and what that meant was probably I wouldn't be working in the team anymore, working on the small things. I'd be trying to work on the sort of bigger picture stuff. So that's a long-winded introduction to my answer to your question. Who should be director of performance? Well, I think, from my side, and perhaps with a little bit of bias, of course, it doesn't matter whether you're a sports scientist or an S&C coach or whatever it is, a physio or a head of medical. But what you need is good people around you. So if you're a physiotherapist as a director of performance and you've got a medical background, you'll need pretty strong leadership from the people who are working in the sports science and the sort of strength conditioning components of the work, to have them as, sounding boards for the things that basically they're more expert in than you are. And vice versa. I think, I've got some good friends. Clive Brewer is an example, who's worked in a number of different sports, and he comes at it more from the strength and conditioning sports science. But, having had some great chats with Clive over the years, he's very across the medical aspects. But again, for someone like Clive to go in, he'd probably get more benefit out of having someone who's a leader in the medical aspects and physiotherapy aspects alongside in his team, even though he's got that breadth of knowledge. So I think it's finding a balanced set of skills across the director of performance role. And, CEOs for major companies, there's not one type of CEO. There's different types of leaders. So I think it comes down more to character and skill set than it does down to a specific practitioner.
And I just mentioned this to you before we started recording, but if we're talking to people now that are practitioners that are getting to that stage of their career where they're looking for that next opportunity and they feel like they can take that step up to leading a team, applying for director of performance roles or whatever it is, what would you say, like, these are some of the key skills that you've got to have to be successful in that role?
Yeah, I think most people who end up in a role like this have had to have proved themselves in their own profession to a point. They have to have earned some respect. The word sort of skin in the game, is probably a good one. Once you've got that and to that level, it's not so much about the technical aspects and the technical competencies. It's about, actually viewing leadership as a skill and being able to develop strong leadership characteristics. And that can come in many, many forms. But I think that's something that, again, I was fortunate to develop through English Institute of Sport. We had a leadership program. I met some really good people that challenged me and put me in my place, I would say, as I was developing as a young man. And that set me on the path. And then I've been under some good leadership as well. So if you want to be a director of performance, there are now high performance masters. Actually, of one of the physios at Arsenal that I work with did a high performance masters. So there are actually qualifications you can do. But I think if you're applying for a director of performance role, being skeptical, I would say that most of them have already been, earmarked for some person. So you need to be networking in the right places with the right people. You need to make sure that you've got all the things on your CV that will promote you and differentiate you from other people, but that you have a really good basis or grounding in leadership. And that doesn't mean you've led a team before necessarily. It just means that you've developed your character and skill set in that aspect of leading other people and developing other people that would make you stand out from the rest. Yeah.
And if we're talking about leadership, is that like the key skill that you feel like you've gone into this role and that's the skill you've had to possibly work on the most? Or is there something else that stands out where you were like, no, I needed to improve on this, and this maybe wasn't something that I realized I'd need as much on?
Yeah, I think there's some technical development pieces that come up just, on a weekly basis, where you might be talking about planning pre-season training blocks, or you might be talking about setting up a rehab pathway. And I still try and keep myself in check with research. One of our coaches, we've had 4 coaches in the last 2.5 years, but one of our coaches here was very sort of very old school sports science based. So wanted to, use a lot of kind of lactate testing. And I spoke to Martin Bouchait, spoke to Rob Thorpe, and again, people who are experts and published in this area, so that I could upskill myself to know, where the sort of world's best practice sat along the thinking around lactate testing, before I then went into the head coach and could have a really good conversation with him and my fitness coach about if we were going to do it, when we were going to do it, and how. And it's, if you don't have that understanding and breadth of knowledge, it's really impossible to go and have a good conversation about influencing a program. So yeah, you end up having to develop technically across quite a broad set of skills. But I think the leadership stuff for me is the key. And I think we spoke before about this. At the moment, I'm waiting on Christmas to read this book, but it's The Habit of Excellence, which is why British Army Leadership Works, by Lieutenant Colonel Langley Sharp, MBE. And if you skim read, which I tend to do quite a lot of, if you skim read, one of the biggest reasons they think that people from Sandhurst are become effective leaders is because they see leadership as a skill. And the development of that is the key part of their success. And leadership then comes in many forms, whether it's communication, developing other people, empowering them to do their job, etc., etc. There's so many things around leadership that you can look at, but not just reading it in a book, not just reading a Harvard Business Review, but actually applying it in real life, and being able to have an opportunity to make mistakes. And you're working with human beings, you've got to establish trust. If you aren't able to establish trust in any environment, you're not going to be very successful. They'll soon find you out. So yeah, those are probably some of the key things.
Yeah, 100%. It's interesting you're saying there about like different approaches as well, because if we relate that to like first team coaches, managers, like you see all the different approaches that they take, don't you? There's different personalities, different ways of leading, and some can be equally successful as well. And players too, like you see some great captains, leaders, don't you, but do it in very different ways. So I think it is, like you say, the skill of leadership.
Yeah, there's not a specific type of leader, is there? I mean, you're right. And it's also that kind of balance around personality. I mean, for those people who've done those kind of insights profiling and have understood themselves first, that's really important. Like, I know what I am on a bad day.
Yeah.
I know the types of people that probably I could rub up the wrong way if I don't consider where they're coming at these problems or where they're coming from. So that's a really important part. And slight tangent here, but we now, when we sign players, we do a sort of psychometric profiling of them, as well as the physical testing and the medical. So we look at, coachability and other things that one of our mental coach sets up for any foreign or English player any Czech or foreign player that comes to the club. We'll do a psychometric screen. Yeah,
it's really interesting, that, isn't it? Because I've heard people speak about that before as well, and that in terms of recruitment, I'm guessing that can be a big part, because you look at cultures and successful teams over the years, like you hear people speak about personalities. And I remember, I think it was on the High Performance podcast, Kasper Schmeichel speaking about like the Leicester team that won the league and all the different personalities that were in that team. They weren't the same by any means, but you had to have these different sort of personalities that obviously complemented one another. And we can take that and apply that to like a sports science team or a physios or whoever, or just a coaching team as a whole, can't we?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're in an echo chamber with people who are the same as you, then there's going to be a lot of blind spots. I must have read another book. So Matthew Syed, Rebel Ideas as well, talks about that. You know, if you've got a knowledge space and you're all in one part of that knowledge space, you don't tend to see what's, you know, potentially hidden, or those kind of things that you need other perspectives on from a group. So a diverse thinking is diversity of thinking, obviously is quite a big buzz, but it means a lot when you sit in a room. And the sort of an example of that, if I ask my team, right, what do we think about this guy? Is he ready to return to play? I really love that one of the guys almost apologetically goes, I don't think he's ready. And he'll have a completely different opinion that's perhaps more conservative to the rest. But he's the one that's on the pitch every day working with that player, and he's seen it, and he's, you know, it's quite in depth, his understanding of what he's seen. So if he doesn't feel like he can put his hand up and challenge everybody else who are pushing in maybe in one direction, we'll end up maybe making some mistakes by pushing too hard. If he wasn't there putting his hand up and feeling comfortable to give his opinion, we would be maybe, I don't know, pushing too hard in some cases where we wouldn't. And sometimes we'll say, look, thanks for the opinion, but we're going to push anyway.
Yeah.
But it's better to have that out there, you know, in an environment where you can then sit down and reach a consensus. Yeah.
But they're the healthy environments to be in, though, aren't they? Where you feel like you can speak out. Yeah, not everything's going to get the go ahead on what you're saying, but that creates good, positive conversation, doesn't it?
It does. And by the way, it's not perfect. You know, I'm not suggesting for 1 second that we always have great conversations. Of course, there's going to be difficulties and different pressures, and scenarios change. And, you know, we've made some mistakes as well as a team when I look back on this season. So, you know, you're constantly evolving. And what's really important is you reflect on it. So, you know, you almost debrief on those mistakes or those moments where the decision could have gone one way and ended up going the other. If you don't reflect on it in the now, in the moment, then you tend to lose those, you know, lessons and opportunity team and develop as a team. Yeah,
Brill. And to shift gears a little bit, Ben, a bit off topic, I know, but we'll tie it in nicely. I just wanted to ask as well about your testing philosophy. So looking into sort of testing, monitoring, obviously people have different views, opinions on how to go about it, but I thought it'd be a good topic to discuss with yourself in terms of your philosophy.
Yeah, God, we could go all day on that, but we won't. So where I've come from is I was in charge of pulling together a lot of the stuff for the EIS around a sort of national remit for looking at screening and monitoring, or screening and testing. I'm not too precious about the words that you use, but you know, I think don't get bogged down in the sort of the rhetoric, but essentially many different teams and practitioners doing things specifically for their own sport, pulled it all together with the FA, England cricket at the time, and England rugby, and got everybody in a room at, I think we went to Wembley to have this discussion, and then we fed it back as a group. So I did a lot of reading around screening and monitoring before those conversations happened. And then I was able to see what best practice was within the sort of, you know, home countries sports, plus also Olympic sports. And that was a massive learning curve for me. And then I had to apply this in the moment with British judo. So there's no point me testing stuff that I'm not going to use. And I think that's one of the keys. So measure the things that matter and make sure that the information is impactful. And so when I went to Arsenal, there was a huge amount of testing done. And I'd say screening, we used to call it screening at the beginning of the season, but then we all agreed that quite a lot of it fell on the floor. Mm-hmm. And actually we skinned it right back. We had the opportunity, we were lucky, we won an FA Cup. And even though we'd had a pretty poor injury season, we stayed in our jobs, and we're given the opportunity to set up a screening and monitoring process. And what we all agreed eventually, through some pretty good heated discussions, was that we're not going to use some of this stuff. We actually not threw out Cybex, that would have probably landed on one of the cars in the car park, but we went, right, we're not using isokinetics for knees, and you know, we're not using hamstrings and quads. in season. So why are we using it? Let's stick with the jumps. Let's stick with the isometric hamstrings that we're using. And so, long story short, essentially, find the stuff that's going to give you a preseason benchmark that you're then going to be able to use to monitor athlete status throughout a season as that changes, whether that's through a long-term development process or whether that's through fatigue, through dense fixture congestion periods. And then the tests you choose, the monitoring tools you use, they have to be reliable and valid. They have to be interpretable. There's no point in having players in and doing 2 hours worth of testing if, again, you're not going to be able to turn around the results. So the back end of that has to be something that is really slick and efficient. And we'd have, pretty much a whole squad once a week at Arsenal going through a monitoring process in about a 30-minute window where we looked at some key measures. And we put that straight into the cloud. That was fed as a sort of flagging system to Colin Lewin, who was sort of at HQ working with players and also feeding back to the manager, to Arsene. And, that became something that over a 3-year period, and Colin's published this actually, he reckoned we had about 65% compliance early on. And then by the end, probably about 95% compliance with the testing process. And I remember being on the M25 one afternoon and Colin phoned me and said, the boss is asking about the data from this morning's testing. Mm-hmm. We're off up to this game, but he wants to know the test results. Like, okay, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Because back 2.5 years ago, there wasn't that sort of opportunity to educate, or there was a limited understanding of the potential of a monitoring process like that. And actually over that 3-year period, the injuries, soft tissue injuries went down 35%. So the long story short is it does depend on, your kind of capacity, the stage that your team is at in its evolution to cope with a screening monitoring process. Maybe that kind of level of understanding. Have you got people there who can use force platforms or force frames or whatever you're going to use? And then can they actually do something meaningful with the data? How do we present that to coaches in a way that's not going to, cause paralysis by analysis, and in a way that can engage with them, it can engage with players. So my testing philosophy is do what's right, measure what matters, make sure you act on it. Otherwise you lose players and staff and everybody just, runs away from it because it's not easy.
Yeah.
You have to have a consistent vision of where that's going to take you. And it's probably not going to reap any benefits for about, 12-month period. I think the last thing to say is that, most people go in and go, well, how long until we get some meaningful data? Well, I think you have a 3 to 6 month surveillance period where you say, we're going to put this in place. We're going to see what happens. If we see something as a massive outlier, then we're going to act on it. But otherwise, we're just going to use this as a process of education. I think you start to get bang for buck when you've got around 20 measures on a player. It usually takes 3 to 5 to get them familiarized. And then, if you're doing any sort of testing, probably around 20 is a decent number to then be able to see meaningful change in those athletes throughout a season that you can trust.
I'm glad you brought that up, actually, because that's something that I've spoken to a few coaches about, where they're talking about collecting data. And obviously there's certain things that they're trying to narrow it down. So this is the useful stuff. This is maybe not so useful at this time, like we've talked about there. But then there's other things, isn't there, that you might just be collecting in the background as maybe a just in case, or things that you might use a little bit more sporadically, or that they might come into play in the future. So then that's the fine line, isn't it, between do we disregard that or do we keep collecting it? And I'm not expecting an answer to say, do we do this or do that? But that's where I suppose there's a bit of confusion in that process as well.
Yeah, you've got to be clear you've got to be clear about sort of short-term, long-term vision. As an example, we've got all of our drills clipped. We've got drill libraries for each specific thing. We can tell you, 5v5, let's say on a small pitch, what the pitch size is. It's nothing new. It's being done elsewhere. It's nothing amazing. But what we know is we know what our players look like. So we know on average then what a centre back will do in that drill. And then we've got a predictive drill builder now where we can look at setting that up and say, well, if you want to do this, if you want to do 5 minutes of that, 10 minutes of this, and, you know, then actually you're going to get this sort of amount. And we can show the difference perhaps between, say, pitch size, between, you know, like the drills that our coaches use. And, you know, on the uptake there, we're ready for when we want to go to that level. And we've got, say, now it's, as I said, it's our fourth coach. And I think coaches work in different ways, you know, like we're here to understand and help them to understand their program and their experience. And we probably use that more behind the scenes than we do on a day-to-day basis with the coaching team at the moment. But we have this long-term view that actually that will be really useful, you know, going 3 months, 6 months down the line when we start to really dig down to another level. But I think where we are at the moment, you know, with this performance team and this coaching group, is we're still developing and building a relationship. You know, it's still relatively new, even though it's not quite a year yet. The new coach came in February and we've not even done a full year together. So that will take time to build understanding and trust and develop those processes.
Yeah, definitely. And that's, we could speak about building buy-in trust, but that'll probably open a whole new can of worms. So we'll move on to the next bit. In terms of, I know a lot of people would have probably seen information, the research that you put out around the shoulders. I wanted to ask initially, where did the interest come in looking into this?
It's a really good question. There's nothing cool like, you know, I was a schoolboy javelin thrower and my shoulder fell off or something like that. No, sorry, it's pretty boring. It's like, well, I ended up working in a lot of collision contact sports, rugby specifically, and then into judo. And judo, like, probably was where my interest was peaked, because we had about 22% of our injuries were shoulders, and actually about 24 were knees. So I could have gone down the knee route, but that'd been done overkill, and not many people were doing shoulders particularly well. And so I just thought, you know what, I'll read a bit more about it, and I've got some shoulders to work with. I need to do it anywhere for my job. And I was rehabbing maybe 5 shoulders a day for weeks/months. And I suppose I got a bit better at it. And then people started to ask me about stuff. And then I worked with Ian Horsley, who's got a great background in shoulders as well. And we set up a course, and that developed well. And people wanted Ian and myself, that small team, to come and talk to them. And that's just grown. And I think, you know, just there was a tipping point around maybe 2011 where I really sort of got interested in it. And then I went to Arsenal, where there weren't many shoulders, but I continued to tick that over as part of my own development through that period. And yeah, I don't know, I find shoulders quite easy, but that's because of hours and hours and hours of reading, of doing. And I think that probably the best thing is actually trying to teach other people how I think about working with a shoulder. That actually, having to do that has been the biggest development for me, is because then you're not only, you know, doing, you're actually having to translate the why about how you're doing your work, you know, and that's been brilliant for me. And that meant that I had to go and read more, ask people more, you know, and that's just evolved. And now I've ended up probably working, you know, as an Englishman working in the US with baseball teams, with the NFL teams. I still consulted with a major league team for this season, and looking to do that same thing again remotely. So I haven't even set foot on the training pitch in the US, but I've been able to add value to a team of athletic trainers and strength and conditioning coaches in shoulders. So and I've just been asked to be on an NFL steering group around preventing shoulder injuries. So it's just, you know, I look back and actually I'm pretty like humbled by the opportunity and where it's taken me, from pretty humble beginnings back in around 2009 to now where, you know, Athletic Shoulders, my company has potential to go in the future.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it's like you said, it's an area that, especially in football, we probably don't focus on as much. But and like you said, looking at the knee or somewhere like that, it's talked about a lot, isn't it? So no, I just thought it'd be interesting to go into where it was the sort of foundations where it came from, and then off the back of that, I remember I think it was Charles Poliquin maybe years ago having like standards that he wanted to hit around the shoulder, and I think it was like an external rotation in relation to bench press and things like that. So I was going to ask you if there are any sort of gold standards that you have like similar to that, or is it a case of taking case by case or player by player?
Yeah, it's always difficult to set up those standards. I thought you were going to pull out the Charles Poliquin, "You can't fire a cannon from a canoe"
I think I
quote,
have
which
used that
is
in the podcast before.
one of my favorite quotes, essentially around transfer of force from lower limb through into upper limb for shoulders. And
Yeah.
that's great, because some of the standards for shoulders are actually, and if you speak, I was fortunate to speak to Eric Cressy, got him on the podcast, which I'll plug later, by the way, our own podcast. And we were talking about standards, and he was reluctant to draw a line in the sand, but he works off some set standards for someone doing a trap bar deadlift, or, from my side, when we're looking specifically at shoulders, I think we're looking at 50% of body weight in the hands for a single, basically a dumbbell press, so horizontal press. When I say that, you're probably going to take off VAT of about 20%. So let's say you've got, if you bench press 100 kilograms, you'll probably be able to dumbbell press 40 kilograms in each hand. All right, and that's maybe a standard that you could set for some of the top athletes. But it changes whether you're a forward or a back in rugby, and so I think that some of our standards now are largely around the data around force testing.
Yeah.
We know, as an example, that you're weak if you don't hit 167 newtons on a force frame external rotation test. We know that if you're below 165 newtons in an Ash test in an I position, and again, for those people that don't know, we can link to the Ash test and other things, but then you're weak in baseball terms. And we know what a good ratio looks like in baseball now, with over 1,000 tests across one organization over a season. So not just published research, but what's going on behind the scenes. And I get asked these questions all the time, like, what's a good rate of force? this is my evening's entertainment. Like, what's a good rate of force development in an eye test position, Ben, at 100 milliseconds? God, I live a life, don't I? But and I'll say, right, well, probably a minimum cutoff is 400, newtons per second at 100 milliseconds is where you want people to be, but they can get up to 1,000. But it depends on how you test. So many different things to consider, and other caveats around setting some standards. But I like to do it. I like to do it because then you've got something to measure yourself against.
Yeah. What about in
There's,
terms of relating that to football? Because we've obviously, you mentioned about rugby, and you mentioned a few weights there that might send shivers through a few footballers' spines.
Yeah, good man. Well done for bringing me back. Well, Mesut Ozil did 3 sets of 6 36 kilogram dumbbells, and that's Mesut Ozil. So there you go. There's a terrible name drop, but also one that I think people will associate with, because that's a player who people don't believe necessarily has the physical strength to manage it. He's seen as a very tactical, technical, gifted footballer in that respect. Yeah. But he was smashing out upper body weights and was hungry for upper body weights because he felt like he needed to develop strength to be able to, compete in the Premier League. And that was one of his limiting factors potentially, was, people kicking him and punching him and him not being able to dish it back. So he felt stronger for it. And he went from, 28s up to 36 over a period of rehab where he had a hamstring problem. And we just helped him to put on a little bit of upper body weight, which was probably quite necessary. But there's a good standard, if Mesut can do it, No disrespect to him, but there's a hunger there to develop some upper body capacity, and he was hitting 36 kg, which is, I don't think I could move that today, to be honest.
Yeah, that's some good weight, some very good weight. It's interesting, isn't it, when you dive into the programs of players like that, because the perception of what people have in terms of players being strong and weak, I think a lot of people from the outside have this vision of a strong player and a vision of a weak player, and it's not always the case, is it, when you start looking into the training and what they do and what they can do as well?
Yeah, people come from different walks of life. They've been told different things, perhaps why they haven't loaded through their life. My current boss, Tomasz Rosicki, he probably came to strength conditioning at the latter end of his career, and we were getting him loading for him some pretty decent weights towards the back end of his career, but he hadn't really done a huge amount of strength conditioning from the early parts of his career. He's just naturally talented, very fast, genetically gifted individual with a brain that's probably even faster. And we don't need to talk about his abilities, but essentially from a health and sort of longevity of career perspective, had he come to strength conditioning a little bit earlier and been taken under someone's wing there and developed that, I think perhaps he wouldn't have suffered some of the things that got in the way of him perhaps spending more time on the pitch. So there's a huge education cultural piece, different philosophies from different countries that will influence whether someone lifts a weight or not. Even in terms of return to play from injury, some countries won't. I know it's a generalization, but obviously now I'm working in a European country, and I've seen players from Germany, Spain, France, vastly different philosophies across just dealing with a muscle injury rehab, which is really interesting. But you wonder why, how can it be so different across different teams, and what's the best way? And I think, very biased about the way that I choose to go about it. Loading's good from my standpoint. Other people are really reluctant to load footballs, and they're really reluctant to load injuries.
Yeah, and I suppose we could probably talk about this for forever, but I suppose culture comes into it, doesn't it? Because I'm guessing everyone's reading similar sort of research, but then there's reading research and putting it into play, isn't there? And it's not just a decision of we're going to go with this. Like, there's going to be other factors, isn't there? Especially in certain cultures and environments that come into it, like you say, in countries where they haven't got that sort of S&C culture experience. It's a harder fight, I suppose, isn't it, to try and get it into the program?
Yeah, and I think that's developed by your own individual experience. If you take someone out and you're doing a hamstring rehab and you decide you're going to go down a acceleration based approach, and then that goes wrong for you because you've got a really powerful, explosive athlete who's not doing 60%, he's doing 90%, and he's not looking after himself. To put him in that situation is higher risk than to put someone who's less explosive in that acceleration based rehab. Very horses for courses is trying to pitch it so that it works for that individual and doesn't increase the risk of recurrence of injury. And whilst I think we managed to somehow get an MRI proven grade 1 hamstring back in 7 days, when I say we as a team, it's hugely down to the individual. So his max speed isn't as high as some people in the team. He doesn't do as much sprint distance. He's a professional athlete who keeps himself well and can manage himself within a game. He came back and played 92 minutes 7 days after a grade 1 confirmed MRI hamstring injury. I've never seen that. I think the best before that was maybe 13 days that I'd seen, and the average is 17 days. So, but from experience, we're often trying to shave time off rehab processes. But most of the conversations I have are like, the longer you can give them, the better. Yeah. And also that it can't be about timeframes. It can only be about stepwise progress. If you pass this marker that we've set you, then you can go and do, if you can pass X, you can go and do Y. And by doing that, you're putting a little bit of a kind of safety net on the process. But what you're not doing is you're not using it to hold them back. In fact, if you have to be prepared that if and when they pass your tests, that you're going to have to let them go and play, or that you're going to have to let them go and sprint or train. Yeah. Make them uncomfortable, make them really uncomfortable standards. But if they pass them, you can't then say, no, you can't go on the pitch because, of another reason. You have to stick with those things. So it's a stepwise progress. It's not time frame related around these things. Psychologically
as well, for a player, that makes more sense, doesn't it? Because if we are, especially for longer term injuries, we know that there's a lot that goes into that from a psychological side. But if we're talking shorter term for players, it's a little bit more manageable, isn't it? That we're saying like next week or the week after, we want you to hit this. And then they've got numerous small little microcycles of that, rather than saying, right, we've got a 12-month period or whatever it's going to be.
Yeah, exactly. Breaking down these targets is key. I think people who don't know me very well will see or listen to me speak and they'll go, he's a very numbers driven or data driven person. And I am, because it grounds the decision making process, but I'm still prepared to listen to, the clinical experiences of a physio as part of, that are they ready process. I'm still willing to listen to the guy who sticks his hand up in a meeting and says, I don't feel he's ready. I know he's passed his hamstring isometric tests. I know he's able to sprint. He's done this volume this week, but I think he's still risky. I'd like to see him train for a few more days and assess the reaction before we go there. I'm still happy to have that less objective data to be used as part of the overall process. So that's kind of the more the merrier. And again, it probably comes back to what we were saying earlier around the knowledge space. If we're just going down forces and measuring forces and looking at numbers, are we missing something that might be key in it? I think I might have gone full circle from like physio world, where it can be a bit fluffy and grey around feeling and tone and what's going on, through to a very objective strength conditioning directed approach. And then I'm not coming full circle, because I think force is one of the key things. And numbers are really important around training volumes. But recently I've started to dip back into like, okay, well, actually, let's make sure that we still capture the uncapturable, if you like, and factor those in as part of the overall decision process. And I think that's just a few lessons learned from speaking to players, speaking to physios, and actually spending more time asking questions rather than necessarily kind of just battering through a rehab process.
Yeah, definitely. I know you just touched on there about producing force, and we'll bring the Poliquin quote up again about not being able to fire a cannon from a canoe and being able to handle the forces that we're producing. But if we relate that to like the end stage process of rehab, return to performance, I wanted to just touch on just finally about where force plates fit into that, and how you utilize force plates in that very late stage of a rehab process.
Yeah, so I've been, again, really fortunate. I met Daniel Cohen, who's for me, he's a friend of mine. So I spend a lot of time on the phone to Colombia. So sure the police will be interested about that. But I spend a lot of time on the phone to Colombia in all hours of the morning. So it's sounding dodgier and dodgier. But essentially, it's all about force platform testing, and it's about myself and Daniel discussing and me tapping into his vast knowledge and experience in that area. Long story short, we're probably going to write a piece or a second part of a piece with Matt Taberner, who's now at the Orlando Magic. He was at Everton and has written some brilliant stuff as part of his PhD in the control chaos continuum. And we're looking at what we describe as session cost, which is essentially, if I give you two examples, we've got one player maybe who's got an ACL coming back to play. We'll look at a counter movement jump or 3 counter movement jumps before they go out onto the pitch. We know what the session is because we've got the GPS data, and then they come back in immediately and they do 3 more counter movement jumps. So the acute post-session response. Then we look at the 24-hour and the 48-hour response as well. So the next morning, before they do anything else, have those things changed? And there's some, not unusual, but some different ways that people react. Some people, they offload their injured limb, but when they go into a session that's quite fatiguing and they use their healthy limb more, they then come back and they're perhaps more balanced on landing forces afterwards because they actually can't use the healthy side as much as previous. So that's one way things can happen. Another thing that can happen is immediately after a session, if it's not too fatiguing, you can see jump numbers go up, and some of the other characteristics around a jump that we'd look into go up as well, almost like a potentiating effect. So that's why capturing it the next morning is really important, to see what's the overall cost of that session and how's that recovery profile over the next kind of 24, 48 hours. So that's probably where leading work is going, I would say, in terms of world's best practice around the people that I know doing good things. And then to give you a recent example, we had a sort of recurrent rec fem problem, and we were looking for some of the reasons why perhaps this might happen. So we started to do some counter movement jumps, and it brought attention and focus to this rehab, and we wanted to set some markers. But what we saw was quite interesting, was around this this metric, which, for those who aren't into jump testing and force plate testing so much, looking at eccentric deceleration, RFD, and that's basically the bottom of the movement, the bottom of the squat before you transition to then start to push your concentric force to then explode off the force platform. It's like athletes who are comfortable throwing their body into the ground harder and faster with higher eccentric deceleration forces are better in terms of performance. And we sometimes see this asymmetry. And what we found in this guy was his jump numbers were going up, but his eccentric rate of force development asymmetry was staying quite asymmetrical, to the point where we needed to do something to influence his program. And that's the key to all of this. It's like, well, so what?
Yeah.
How are we going to change things? And we felt that he fatigued early through that side. We started to do some blood flow restriction stuff with him around a metabolic loading. We also started to work on that eccentric deceleration phase using actually some eccentric loads and some heavier loads. And overall, actually now his jump height, as one measure, has increased, by a considerable amount over quite a short period of time. But still, when he's playing, he's playing on a Thursday in Europe and he's playing on a Sunday, what we see after those is that jump heights, as a very blunt measure of fatigue, can go down, but that even when the jump heights stay high and he's prepared, we can still use this kind of, that's the tip of the iceberg, but what's underneath the surface. And what we see is that eccentric RFD in that respect is our marker of, or our sense checker really, to see, is he going in the wrong direction or is he coping well? And most of the time, interestingly enough, when we ask him how he's feeling, when things aren't looking right on the force platforms, he tends to feel like the answer good himself. That subjective looking a person in the eye and developing a trusting relationship is a huge part of also what we're going to do in terms of making decisions about whether he's ready or not to feature and play 90 minutes, or whether we need to start to look after him.
I think that really nicely sort of wraps up and gives a great practical example of everything we spoke about, right into developing trust with the player, getting involved in the process, and then the testing, what's needed, what's not, because it's relating it back to, like you said, performance on the pitch, and like what we're doing with any data that we're collecting as well, isn't it? So I really appreciate you going through that, because I think that really nicely caps off everything we spoke about. If it's okay with you, Ben, we'll just move on to the final few questions that we finish each podcast with.
Sure.
First one, I know you've mentioned a few names already, a few of which that have been on the podcast already, I'm glad to say. But so who are some of the biggest influences on your career so far?
Yeah, you sent these to me in advance, which is great. Thanks for doing that, because otherwise the second question would have killed me. I think you'd have had just silence. The first one around biggest influences, I basically look at it as two teams. So the English Institute of Sport team that I was fortunate to lead in London, and again, it was me working with some bright young things like James Moore, Mark Young. For those people who don't know them, have probably put together some of the best learning and education pieces that I've ever witnessed. And they were on my team, and I could just go and spend time with them on a day-to-day basis, at different track and field sites across London. It was fantastic and extremely challenging and brutal at times for my own personal physio skill level. So that was pretty cool. And then around that time, there's Ben Rosenblatt there, Alex Wolf, Raf Brandon, Dan Howes. Just that was a real golden period for kind of the English Institute of Sport and practitioners, and I was in amongst it. So you couldn't turn up at work if you didn't have your A game,
Yeah.
So that was one group, and then I do, and we mentioned Colin earlier, but I do think that the team that Colin set up at Arsenal, bringing in diverse people to help solve some of the problems he was experiencing, was actually like hugely on his part, kind of a hugely, what's the word? I think it's very perceptive on his part to look at where perhaps he wanted the team to go. He had a vision of what he wanted to do. He didn't want people who were just from football. He wanted to bring diverse opinions into the team and people who could lead departments. So there we had, a lot of people like Andy Rolls, James Haycott, Deck Lynch, Simon Harland, Gary O'Driscoll, the doctor. I'll name them all. Shad Forsyth, who's worked with the German national team. I'm probably forgetting a couple of people there. Having mentioned loads, I should probably mention them all, and I'm going to get killed for not mentioning some, but I think I've got them most. That was really another good team where, again, day-to-day basis, you're solving problems together. And we were in the trenches 6-7 days a week. So yeah, those are my biggest influences, those two teams, because I do speak to a lot of individuals, as I've already name dropped, and more. And my network's great through people like Daniel Cohen and who they've connected me to in the States. And I can just pick up the phone to some of the best people in the world. And luckily they pick up the phone as well.
That's always handy. The answer.
Oh God, it's Ben again. It's Ben again.
Well, here we go, Ben. The question you've been looking forward to. What would you say your biggest strength is as a practitioner?
Well, outside of the sort of shoulder expertise, which I have to kind of, put out there, I suppose. I actually cheated. I asked one of my team, and he said, well, you have got this expertise and recognition for being a shoulder guy, and you're doing this work at that level in shoulders, but actually you do have a breadth of knowledge across a number of things. So the broad knowledge that you need to be a director of performance, to be across a lot of things, I think would be biggest strength. One of the things that one of the players I worked with a lot and was very close to at Arsenal said about me was that he felt like I was always trying to find a solution, like that I was pushing to try and find it. I wasn't happy with where we were. I was always trying to find a solution that helped him. That came from him. It was quite nice to hear a footballer take time to actually think about what they think of you. And I'd say that goes for my very progressive. I always want to have an influence and impact. Colin and I used to, probably bump heads a little bit because I was trying to smash through walls to try and, get things in place and improve us as a team. But now, actually, on the flip side, now that I'm in charge of a team, I'm kind of like, look, make sure you see this progress over the last 2.5 years. Don't worry so much about this short term. Look how far we've come. Yeah. And I've actually gone full circle, and I've become an echo for Colin, which I think is hopefully quite a good thing.
Yeah, brilliant. And then finally, mate, I always ask people their approach to like CPD and continued learning, because I think it's really interesting to hear about different practitioners' approaches, and also when you're really busy, like how it fits in with what you do. So what's your sort of approach to that?
yeah, I did a lot of formal education when I was younger, when I was just purely a physio. As you heard, I read quite a bit when I need to around the stuff that turns up day to day. But best way of doing it is to use your network. And I remember when I was looking at my own development at Arsenal, we had a development budget. I literally said, I want to go to the States. I said, why do you want to go to the States? Well, I've done a physio masters, a strength and conditioning masters. I don't really, there's no more sort of formal learning I want to go and do in that respect. But I just want to go and spend time with some of these people that I believe are highly influential in the industry. Mm-hmm. So I was very lucky to get the opportunity to travel to the US, firstly, as part of my development at Arsenal. But secondly, when I had my midlife retirement, I got on a plane and I went and did a West Coast tour of the US and spent time with good people. I went to like NFL teams. I went to Navy SEALs. I went to all over the place. I think you get to a point where the formal learning isn't going to be good enough for you. And it's not that you need to, it's not that you fully replace that. You're always going to be reading papers or trying to keep current and relevant. But I do believe that the sort of network stuff now and the ability to just jump on a call for 45 minutes to an hour around something specific topic, those are the things that help you develop more than anything else. Especially when you get to sort of a later stage of your career.
No, it's a great point. I think that's come up numerous times. Like some people have mentioned certain resources and things, but the majority of people mention speaking to people, whether you can do visits or obviously technology is great now. We can just jump on a Zoom or a call or whatever. Like it's easy to do, isn't it now? So I think that's great advice.
Yeah, I think, it depends on your mood. I mean, at the moment, I've stopped listening to too many sort of educational or kind of industry-based podcasts. I keep them down to a minimum. I'm actually listening to some true crime stuff right now, so like it's like just to actually stop some of the noise, because I think you can get really bogged down with it.
Yeah.
But there are periods where you get into it and you want to read articles, you want to, and I tend to go like that. I'm very binge in terms of my willingness to develop. And when I'm on it, I'm on it. And there's times though when you need to, look after yourself a little bit, give yourself a mental break and get away from sport, get away from constantly listening to industry-based stuff and actually go and do something for your own mental health. So that's where I am right now, especially long year, winding down to a winter break.
Oh, you mentioned before, like with the book that you're reading, like you've got to be aware of areas that you can improve, and it doesn't always just come from sport, does it? Or football in particular. Like there's loads of there's business, there's all other areas we can learn from, that they use very similar skills that we can sort of transition into what we do.
Yeah, exactly. And it becomes more relevant when you can apply it to what you're doing in the moment, so I think when you're exposing yourself to quite a lot of different resources, there's often something that makes you click, or a light bulb goes on as to maybe how you can do something a little bit different. And I can't think of a good example, but I definitely had one of those in the last week around, I think it was around looking at the way we set up rehabilitation train or more preparation training, and are we creating enough kind of chaos around that, or are we allowing athletes to focus too much internally on what they're doing and just landing on a bozu, or how's that transferring into the sport? And that came not from listening to anything technical. I think I was like reading something or listening to an audio book or whatever it was. And again, the light bulb went off, and I went in and I had a chat with my couple of the physios independently. And the next day there was like balls and bozus and bands and everything around the place.
So, banning you from doing any reading outside.
I think it was a little bit overkill, the reaction to me saying I think we need to do something more, but maybe it's a good sign that people are listening to me.
Yeah, no, it's a great point as well. Sometimes removing yourself out of that environment, that situation, it does spark creativity and I suppose reflecting on what's going on as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant, mate. Well, thank you very much for coming on, Ben. Let's just wrap things up by we've said about the research that you put out, the information around shoulders, but also the podcast as well. Have you got the links in terms of where would you send people to go?
Yeah, so the podcast is in Form Performance, and myself and Andy McDonald run that with a couple of other people that help us there, and that's developing really nicely. I think you can follow me on Instagram as like Ben Physio Coach, or that's my personal one, but really probably Athletic Shoulder is the best one, and it's the same on Twitter. It's Athlete Shoulder on Twitter. But yeah, if anybody wants to reach out, LinkedIn or anything, doesn't matter. And quite honestly, the people that have reached out, and it's not that many, I must say, but the people who have reached out, I've got quite a number of people now who are in my wider network who I learn from on a day-to-day basis. And originally it was just an introduction over something like this. So yeah, please reach out. I've got a bit of time when I'm not on the phone to Colombia, and when I'm not worrying about what RFD looks like in an eye test. I've got a bit of time on my hands, so I'm only too happy to give a bit back and help out if I can. So yeah.
Brilliant, mate. Well, I really appreciate your time, Ben, and thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks a lot, mate.
Top man. Stay in touch.
All right, cool.